Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the special half-term edition of the Voice of Authority webinar, brought to you today by Wilmot Dixon and Inner Circle Consulting. My name is Toby Fox, and I'm the Managing Director of 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. As regular viewers will know, our job is to keep our network of councils and developers and investors and their influencers and advisors connected. And we've been doing that in normal times, and we used to love doing it at physical events. But during lockdown, we've been doing it through this channel, the Voice of Authority. It's a platform for councils to discuss their ambitions, their challenges, their influences, and issues of urgency. Now, as we make our way through lockdown 3, we're more determined than ever to keep that conversation going and keep our network communicating. And to that end, we're going to be back next Thursday at 11 AM with law firm Davitt Jones Bould and a session entitled The Tipping Point, the impact of financial pressures and changing PWLB regulations on councils and members and officers. And you can register to watch that at thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. If you've already signed up for free membership, either at voiceofauthority.co.uk or our LinkedIn members group, you'll be receiving our updates on more compelling themes and topics that we've got coming up over the next few months, and our invitation for you to get involved. So get in touch. We look forward to working with you. Back to today, though, and this special half-term edition. We're discussing schools and COVID-19 and how we make safe spaces for learning. I'm sure there are plenty of homeschooling parents watching who would say any classroom is a good classroom. As far as I'm concerned, just get them back to school. But let's consider that the pre-pandemic Clever Classroom study found that differences in the physical design of a classroom explain 16% of the variation in the learning progress of pupils in those spaces. It's been argued that even in normal times, fashions in teaching change faster than buildings, but right now one might think that best practice in teaching is going through some very rapid rethinking. So firstly, we're going to navigate through some of that new thinking. Of course, new thinking means a chance to build back better, and considering that phrase without any political baggage, for local authorities, does building back better mean forging closer ties between schools and their local communities? Our second theme today is looking at any benefits to be had from moving away from schools as fortresses and containing their populations and keeping unwanted elements out. Can schools move into communities, repurposing for learning space that has become otherwise redundant? And finally today, another aspect of repurposing, the demographic bulge that has led to a spurt of school building has in places passed, and irrespective of COVID-19, classrooms are emptying. Rather than continue a cycle of knocking down schools only to have to rebuild them the next time demographics demand it, are there ways to protect learning capacity by repurposing empty classrooms? So it's a fascinating set of questions developed with colleagues at Inner Circle Consulting and a panel of great minds to tackle them. The next hour is going to be a treat. It's a great pleasure to welcome to the Voice of Authority in alphabetical order, Professor Peter Barrett, Emeritus Professor at Salford University, Honorary Research Fellow in the Department of Education at Oxford University. Roger Forsdyke, Managing Director, London and South at Wilmot Dixon. Merlin Joseph, Strategic Director for Children's Services at Lambeth Council. And Ange Tyler, MAT co-founder at the Griffin Schools Trust. I've got the best job in the world because I now get to spend an hour talking with these brilliant minds. And you viewers can join in. You can use the Q&A to fire in questions to fuel our discussion, and by all means use the chat to share your thoughts with other viewers. We've got a few surveys and polls for you as well, so you can contribute by responding to those when they pop up on your screens. Now, let's get the conversation started with Professor Peter Barrett. Peter, as briefly as possible, please could you set out for us how COVID-19 has impacted on the best practice for school and classroom design?
Okay, Toby, thanks for that. And hello, everybody. It's very nice to be talking to people, even if it's virtually. I mean, we're in a funny sort of state, aren't we? And I'm really trying to reflect on school design and the impacts of school spaces on pupils, from the basis of the work I've done in the past, but interpreting that into the effects that COVID has had, because COVID's been like a huge enforced experiment. I think probably my colleagues will say they've had to do things they wouldn't have considered before. And it's quite interesting in a sense to reflect on what impacts there have been. So the study we did on schools did actually show that the physical spaces had a an effect of 16% on the variation, or explained 16% of the variation in learning. So it's a big impact when you think 70% is explained by variations amongst the children themselves. So very significant. And it was things like heat, light, sound, air quality, those types of things. And what struck me is actually how obsessed everybody's got with fresh air suddenly. I mean, it's been really, really noticeable with the schools I've been into, and they've been limited, so I've only got a partial view. But we did take measurements, and they had windows open all over the place. This was in the autumn, and the air quality in the classrooms was the same as outside in terms of CO2 levels, which is a surrogate measure of air quality. And so basically it was like being outside, being inside, which was brilliant in terms of our study, because you need oxygen for your brain to work. And if you don't do that, you can't learn. And so although they weren't doing it for that reason, I'm sure it was having very beneficial effects. The interesting thing was that as a consequence of that, the temperatures in the classrooms were only about 16 degrees. So for children, they normally need it between, let's say, 18 and 22 degrees. Boys a bit cooler than girls, teachers a bit hotter than pupils. So what you're actually getting is really good air quality, which is great, but you're actually having slightly cold classrooms, which is not so great. It's outside the comfort level unless you put on the right sort of clothes. And so there's sort of balancing acts going on. And behind that, there are some really, really big issues for head teachers and the like, which is if you leave the windows open, especially in the winter, you're losing energy, and that's costing money. Can you afford to do it, or can you not afford to do it? So I can see real tussles going on in practice there. As you go into the winter as well, you might get into issues of dampness and humid air, and that's very unhealthy within classrooms. And so I can see things getting more complicated as we're in the winter phase now, rather than in summer or spring or whatever. So the sorts of factors we were looking at have been impacted quite considerably. One of the major factors was daylight. Daylight is actually a sterilizing thing, as we all now know. I mean, we all knew that anyway, but and so the whole issue of letting daylight into the classroom and getting that benefit and getting the children out of the classroom into the open air has become very much more in focus than perhaps it was before. So there are all those practical things about comfort within schools. And I'm not going to say much more than that, except there's a whole batch of things, which I'm sure my colleagues will talk about, and I'll certainly add in as well if I can, about the human reaction to spaces. We've noticed, and we've heard from the teachers we've spoken to, that quite a lot of the children coming back in have really been quite neglected. They're really not used to being in amongst a whole load of people. Some schools have had to create quiet spaces to allow children to be able to cope while they transition back into actually being in a more busy environment. A sort of home-like environment and feeling at home and ownership of the space and secure are all big, big issues, I guess, that are floating around that, you know, were important. They were factors that we measured before, but I think, again, very much heightened and tweaked by everything we've been confronted with. So I'll leave it there, but I'm sure the people in practice have been seeing these things very much on a day-to-day basis.
It's a perfect start, Peter. Thank you very much indeed. Ange, can we turn straight to you from an operational point of view? I mean, you're in a school day in, day out. How do you reflect on Peter's observations?
I'd be interested to think a little bit more about how some of those practical things about the environment are actually linked to more cultural issues, and I wonder whether there are some links there. I think the real challenges for us are around those cultural issues. And if we start with the classroom, there are lots of things that have impacted on the way school buildings are used as a whole. Corridor spaces, outside spaces, celebration spaces, eating spaces. But if we just start with the classroom, I think one of the major challenges of COVID has been to the notion of pedagogy. What does it mean to teach? What does it mean to teach, and how do we teach? And I see that some of the earliest solutions to the fact that we had some students in school, some students not in school, students in bubbles, some isolating, some of those solutions focus very much on knowledge and knowledge acquisition. And I think if you talk to, well, I don't think I've ever met a teacher who doesn't see learning exactly as we're doing it now. So we will listen to each other, we will reflect on what each other has said. I came to this conversation in one place, and I know I will go away in a different place because I will hear what colleagues have got to say on the topic. And that kind of co-creating of knowledge and new knowledge and learning is the first thing that's very much under threat, with the need to separate students, to have them masked, to have them possibly fewer in a group, crucially to face forward. It's very, very difficult to co-construct new knowledge and meaning if you're facing forward. So we've had to think about, obviously technology has been a massive part of the solution for us, but even that, we've had to be careful that colleagues don't become over dependent on just providing knowledge or material that students can access on their own, sometimes on a phone, sometimes on a tablet. Obviously not every family has access to dozens of devices. So I suppose what I'm saying is that most of the challenges so far have been very cultural. There have been cultural challenges that COVID has made us revisit what we're about. And that then affects the space and how we design the space. And so we're doing a lot of that at the moment. And that extends out into the way we use the whole school building. What are schools for?
How many of those changes do you think are going to endure, Ange? What do you see the sort of duration of this?
I think some of the changes around technology will certainly endure, and I think we all know that. I think it's only the health service that's in constant research shown as more resistant to change than the education sector. We think we know what we're doing, and we like to carry on doing that. And we've been very I've got colleagues who are amazing with digital. But I think this has shown up that as a sector, we are quite a long way behind. And we're quite a long way behind because there's not been investment in the infrastructure. We don't have the investment in what we need to do technology. And those of us that are middle-aged and above have not been trained in using it at the heart of our pedagogy. And we've suddenly been, like everybody else, pushed forward really, really quickly to engage with digital technology, so that I can now have this conversation with you. A year ago, I didn't even know what Zoom was. And I'm not the only person. This is how I do most of my day at the minute. And we're looking at better and better ways of using this. And of course, this is great for, I think of the cultural impacts in a school, say assemblies. So we try to have daily assemblies or regular assemblies, because those of you that know school cultures know that that's how you build school culture. Well, suddenly we can have assemblies across schools. So we have 13 schools, and suddenly we can have a morning assembly with 8,000 students, not 800. And that's really exciting. And that kind of thing will definitely endure. The whole move to outside and how we use outside spaces, that's a journey we are already on as a group of schools. We're very keen to move as much learning outside as possible. I was interested, Peter, in your comment about temperature, because of course a student would like a temperature between, I think you said 18 and 22, if they're sitting with a piece of paper and a pen. But all our research shows that only 1 in 3 students learns anything that way. So, why are we heating classrooms for the 1 in 3 that like a kind of sedentary style of learning, rather than thinking about all the different ways that young people learn and need to learn, and again, how that impacts the space and how we use space. So the move to outside is something that is becoming an out of fashion in education. It's very, very key in early years learning, but in our secondary schools as well. If we're to maintain things like our music, we've had to move that outside. And rather than compromise our provision, we've looked at how we can deliver it in a more creative way to meet those safety expectations. And that could be outside singing. But we're looking at how we, with any new buildings, ensure that there's as quick access to outside space as possible. And that's pretty standard. Those of you that have designed new buildings know that that's standard with the small children. It's not standard with older children. You have to really fight. If you're getting a new condition project through a government stream, you have to fight to get that quick access. So we're looking at that sort of thing as well. So I think that move to outside will endure as well.
That's fascinating stuff, Ange. Thanks very much. And Roger, there's a lot for you to pick up here on behalf of the entire design and build industry in schools. But some great thoughts on multi-site schooling, on outside learning, and also on those sort of seemingly simple, the basics of ventilation, temperature control, and so on. What are your thoughts on building design and construction going forward?
I think it's a really interesting one, Toby, and listening to Peter about the impacts of the environment on the educational outcomes is really vital to us, and we've known it for a long time, as we all do. The spaces that they create, the natural light, the ventilation, but also the acoustics. One of the problems with opening windows, which everybody wants to be able to do, is the acoustic issues that you sometimes have with that and the disturbance that creates. So it's always a balance. But I guess I'm a big advocate of passive house and creating, because passive house is not only a really, really good space for education, but it's also really good for the planet. And I think our youth is looking to see us work our values, work the values we explain about, what is the cost of maintaining, what is the cost on our planet of running these facilities, which quite frankly has been pretty low down the priority list over the last few years, and I think is fast coming up the priority list. What COVID has made us think about is all the things that your guests have talked about. What will it look like in the future? But I guess the communities we've lost for a time will want to be re-engaged, and they'll want to be re-engaged in fantastic spaces first. And my experience of building, if those passive house spaces also then make them zero carbon, which is a mission we're on, because ultimately, why would you go to school that's a fantastic space if it's running like a V8? It's got to be a consideration. And I think that's really the mission, as well as the spaces we create, that we've got to consider for the future.
Okay, so we need school design to change in order to accommodate new ways of learning and teaching, but also in order to save the planet, that there has to be a new way of thinking of construction materials and so on as well.
And absolutely right. I think the industry, my industry, is being changed by the new construction playbook, which is trying to drive not just the cost, but trying to drive other drivers like zero carbon, like social impact. And I think when we're building new spaces, we have to consider more than just the price. We've got to build fantastic spaces, as Peter said, because if we don't, we're disadvantaging the future generations. And I think that's vital. And we know well what a good space looks like. I think we've been doing that for a good few years. But I think other outcomes, and the construction playbook from our perspective and what the government's trying to drive, is an outcomes-based approach. And it's been very, very difficult in a tendered environment to actually achieve that. And I think the government's on the right track to actually build better spaces for everybody, not just for the people that use them.
Okay, Roger, thank you very much indeed. So, Merlin, it always comes to this, doesn't it? What's the council going to do about it? We've got all of these changes, COVID-related changes and immediate changes, and on ventilation and daylight and being able to learn outdoors and facing forwards and masked children and that kind of COVID-related stuff. But we've also got long-term trends that some of this is going to endure. We've got multi-site schooling now is really within our grasp, if not happening already, and also the climate emergency. Schools have to reflect how we're changing our behaviour in relation to the climate. So what would you like to pick up on in all of that, Merlin?
Okay, thank you, Toby, and thanks for this invitation. Really great opportunity to have this discourse. Very, very interesting. Just before I pick up that, I just wanted to pick up a point that Peter made around children, young people coming back to school with a number of emotional health and well-being issues. And I think what I would say is that our schools and our head teachers have been absolutely fantastic in this pandemic. I mean, they've thrown their hat in the ring, and they've been able to come up with really creative solutions to respond to the issues. And I think, and so, you know, we talk a lot with our head teachers, and what we've been actually doing is looking at how we can develop services within our schools. So, for instance, in Lambeth, we already have social workers in our schools, where we've got mental health workers. We're now looking at speech and language, because what we're seeing is, certainly talking to a couple of head teachers, some of our younger pupils are finding it very difficult to articulate in terms of speech and language. So we're already thinking, how can we address those issues by having speech and language and therapy within the school setting. And schools have been really, really responsive. So, for instance, in Lambeth, we had a surge of infections, and you know, one of our schools immediately became a surge site and a testing site for testing for COVID. So, really responsive to the needs of the community. But I think you've already mentioned, Toby, about the fact that you know, the predicted baby boom that we all thought, and made great investments in the sort of futures for schools and the capital programme, has actually not materialised. So what we've seen is actually a reduction in births, and actually it's been, I think 2008, the London birth rate was has fell by the largest percentage. So it is reducing. We've obviously got welfare reform, we've got Brexit, and we've got families during the pandemic seeing, actually you can work from home but live in the leafy countryside. So we've seen families also moving outside of London. So we really need to think creatively about our schools. Now, in Lambeth, and I think head teachers will thank me for saying, is that we don't particularly want to mothball our schools. We actually see them as a real hub of the community. So we're in conversations with our schools about how we might be able to do that. Now, Lambeth, for those of you who are unaware, sadly has very high youth violence and knife crime. And one of the things that we absolutely want to look at is how schools can be a safe haven for those young people who find themselves on the street and groomed by gangs. So we're talking to our schools about becoming that safe haven. One of the things that we're doing quite a lot in Lambeth is talking to the local community. So what would that look like? We have a number of our schools who are in the neighbourhoods, in the community. So what can our schools be doing, and how can they become representatives within the local community? So we've had a few listening events, and what our residents are very clear on is that actually they see schools as a really important space within their community, and about how can they be used to support local businesses, support after school clubs. We already have breakfast clubs, but schools becoming much more of the, as some of you will remember, the old extended school service, but a modern version of that, really. So we have wraparound services to support those most disadvantaged young people. I mean, obviously, in that discourse, it's quite difficult because obviously we're still in lockdown, and as restrictions lift, there'll be more of an opportunity to develop that. But certainly our residents are keen for schools to become that local business. We could have, you know, pop-up businesses in our school settings, because our schools currently have quite a number of spare classrooms, spare spaces, and it's about how we can utilise those spaces to become much more effective, and for communities feel that the school is an extension of that local community. So that's what we're working on at the moment. But also thinking, you talked a little bit, Toby, about the high street. And in Lambeth, we've got some great buildings. You know, we've got the Ritzy, huge buildings that we potentially could think about how we can enable our pupils to go back to school by utilising those spaces. Because probably social distancing is going to be with us for some time on. And I guess the schools are impacted about bubbles having to go home. You know, if you have school staff who are sick, they all have to go home. So maybe thinking about how we can utilise those buildings where we can practice safe distance, social distances, and enable those youngsters to go back to school and tackle the issues of the gap in learning that we've all heard about in the local news and actually seen with our own eyes.
That's brilliant stuff, Merlin. Thank you. You've teed up the rest of the conversation very nicely. And Peter, did you want to come in on that?
It was just to say that you made me think, Merlin, and the other contributions, that there's a huge dimension in the background in relation to buildings, which is about flexibility. The whole issue of flexibility for different users, different times, different modes. It's always been important, especially with pedagogies where it's blended learning or whatever. But it seems to me a very important thing. And some of those unexpected lessons from COVID that I've heard teachers saying is that actually, at times, sitting the pupils in a row, facing forwards, which they had to do, which they would never have done, ever, they found was really beneficial for some subjects because they really concentrated better. And they want in the future to do that sometimes and to do group work and project work and other things at other times. But they want to start using perhaps a fuller range of possibilities when appropriate. The other thing that came through to me, and this comes back to the issue of reducing demographic, I must confess I wasn't aware of that, but that's a massive thing. Because every London school we've been to in the past has been building on their car parks. They just haven't got enough accommodation, but maybe it's shifted. What they also found was that because of having key workers in and having small classes, they reflected exactly what all the literature says, which is that children make really good progress in small groups. You know, when you've got a small class rather than 30 as a maximum stroke minimum. And so if we've got fewer children, but we've got the classrooms, perhaps we should be trying to actually have smaller classes. If we find that we can work virtually and at home sometimes, but at other times in the school, perhaps we should be flexible to that. And Ange was saying the whole issue of co-learning or co-creating of knowledge, face-to-face learning with people, or perhaps that's what we ought to be doing in school, but perhaps we shouldn't be sitting at school all looking at computers, which we could do somewhere else. So I think it's going to raise a lot of issues about being flexible in how we do things by being flexible about how we use the spaces we have. I think it's a very interesting time.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Andrew, we'll come to you in just a second, but just before we do, Peter, could you just unpack very slightly on what you were just saying? The teaching in rows facing forward, was that specific subjects or was it different subjects in different places? Was it more dependent on the pupil in the place?
Okay, so this is what I was told by the teachers. I don't know it, but and I've got to be careful how I'm going to say it in shorthand. It was the hard subjects. It was maths and English. But of course, it's silly to say they're the hard subjects, but it was the subjects where, as an individual, they sometimes have difficulty getting them to concentrate. And so they were thinking they normally do those in the morning, and maybe a different layout of the classroom would suit in some of the morning sessions versus the rest of the day. Yeah. Interesting.
Okay, great stuff. Just before we go to Ange, Roger, I just wanted to unpack a little bit, connect a little bit to what Peter was just saying. We're talking about flexible spaces, increasingly flexible spaces, and I know you've already been designing and building spaces as flexible as you can, but does that introduce a sort of any difficulties for you constructing schools? And then secondly, have you noticed a change in the demand for smaller spaces compared to larger spaces in schools?
No, not at present. We haven't noticed anything like that, but I think the flexibility is a really interesting point, because you also got to remember, particularly as you sort of break out of this, the safeguarding issues around pupils and how you segregate and make sure that the safeguarding requirements are absolute in the built environment, because that is one of the key considerations, that where you're using buildings in a flexible manner, that you can actually maintain your safeguarding protocols. And that becomes quite a burden actually on some of the solutions that we've generated, particularly when you've got shared use around sports facilities and schools that may get used, and how the protocols around that are particularly difficult. And I think the flexibility that we're talking about and the learning, I think it was probably Angie that was saying that, we probably as a community, we're quite bad at change because we know what works, and we've sort of legislated what works, and that sometimes works against flexibility in response. So I think it's a really interesting conversation about how we can be more flexible in the responses we create within the rules, because those rules have been generated over years of learning, and I think that's a key point. And how flexible can we be about adapting the rules?
That's an excellent point. And you wanted to pick up on something?
It was just to say, really, this whole discussion brings up some pretty fundamental issues for me that are expressed through space and how we use it, but are not confined to that. And it comes back to what Merlin said about what the community wants from the school. And we need to ask ourselves what schools are for, because they're not just about classrooms and learning. They're about where young people, well, what are they about? What are they about? Are they places where we're preparing youngsters to pass exams that don't seem to happen anymore, to get ready for an economy that actually seems to be doing quite well or not, regardless of whatever? None of us seem to understand how it ebbs and flows. Or are they places where young people come together and learn what it means to live in society before they go out and live in society? And we've already made reference to that. Roger, through the fact that he said, there are these pressures now on what our buildings look like and what they're made of. Some people are already making a connection between the destruction of the planet and the spread of a pandemic, and it's not coincidental that both things are happening at the same time. And Merlin has talked about the community's desire and want and need for the school to be at the heart of the community and to be a partial solution to some of the problems that our young people face. But not just in our inner cities now, but they face lots of real strains and stresses and difficulties. And I think we've got to be careful that we don't reduce the conversation to functional things just like light and heat and so on, because we can inadvertently find ourselves making decisions that look pragmatic and useful, but that erode the culture of a school. And what happens in a school, the success in a school, the success in a classroom is linked to the culture of that classroom and of the whole school. Something as simple as space. We've seen in education how in attempts to save money, school spaces have reduced and reduced and reduced, so that condition funding now, we have 2 schools that have lost their provision around the arts, around drama, around music, because they are not they're not considered in condition funding when you replace broken old buildings that are now out of condition. And we've got to, I suppose what I'm saying is the conversation needs to be broader than the piecemeal, what works for this, what works for that, because we could find ourselves in a place that we don't want to be in 5 or 10 years' time, because we've made decisions out of context. And I've got to say, Peter, you'll have to go up on a roof and take me out with a rifle before I ever agree that facing front for learning is learning. Because 35 years in the most difficult schools in the country, I'm telling you, it isn't.
Yeah, fair point, and we'll let Peter come back to that any second now. And also, I know that this is the conversation that Lambeth is having right now, so Merlin will want to speak to it as well. But Ange, before we hand over, could you just say to me, this movement of people out of city centres, which seems to be underway in London and elsewhere, and the sort of general decline of populations in large cities, if that is the case, is that affecting the future for your trust? I mean, are you looking at new sites outside of major cities, or how does it change your strategy for new building?
It doesn't, and to be honest, it's more complex even than that, because we have to remember that we are, I love Lambeth and I love what Merlin says. I've never worked there, but I've had friends that over the years have really sung the praises of what Lambeth has tried to do. And those of us in education know that there are certain London authorities that have got a good name for really trying to do the best with their children's services. But you have to remember, we live in a marketplace. And I think lots of us in that don't like that, but that's where we operate now as schools. And so it's not as simple as the rising and falling of demographics, I'm afraid. I do appreciate that that is having an effect, but lots of other things have an effect on who comes to our schools and who doesn't. So it's not as simple as that. I think I worked in Croydon a number of years ago, and there were changing demographics there, and there was the whole kind of development of the notion of the magnet facility. So, for example, with one school that was in the middle of, virtually in the middle of a forest, nobody knew it was there, only the very local community, and the school needs children to get on a bus and come to it. And so we brokered a link with the Brit School. So suddenly it had something to magnetise students to come to it. So while we're working in this kind of market world, we do need to think about ways to get children to move areas, if that's the way it's going to go. So there's that kind of level as well. There's that element as well.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much, Ange. Merlin, feel free to pick up on any of that. And also, if you could, if you're aware of the details of the demographic change that's underway at the moment, anything you can tell us to paint a picture about that would be helpful. And finally, moving the conversation on, the repurposing of high streets. I mean, what sort of spaces are you thinking you might be able to use to forge new links between schools and the rest of the community in Lambeth?
Okay, thanks.
That's a lot of questions, wasn't it?
Yeah, no. I mean, so let me deal with the facts around population change first, because that's quite easy. So we know that birth rates are falling across England and Wales for a fourth succession year. So in 2018, London's births and that of England and Wales fell by the largest single percentage since the mid-70s, which I've already said. And London councils have done some analysis, and in January 2020 determined that London will have 84,384 surplus school places in 2022-2023, with 80% of these in primary school settings. And over 2,000, so in Lambeth, over 2,000 primary school places were added in Lambeth schools between 2009 and 2014 to cope with a rapidly increasing population. So at that point, we thought, baby boom, we need to build more. So we got some fantastic buildings, but obviously some of them are now have empty classroom. But since then, there's been a drop of almost 25% in the number of births, along with other factors, as I've said, just as Brexit, welfare reform, that has led to a year-on-year fall in reception numbers expected to continue until at least 2024 to 25. So I think, so those are the facts. I mean, I think what we're saying in Lambeth is that we don't want to be reactive to that data, because what we know is that in the past, what has happened, schools have been mothballed or closed, etc. What we're wanting to do is use the school estate, the whole school estate, to do something different, because probably we don't know what's going to happen after the pandemic. We don't know what's going to happen as Brexit continues. And the economy starts to become much more buoyant. That's the hope. So the anticipation is that families may move in, and we may get to a position where those places are absolutely needed, and we don't want to have to then think about building new schools. So we've got the buildings. Let's see how we can utilize them better to support local communities. And we're thinking, really, really broadly. I mean, obviously, we're in the initial stages of that, and a lot of it is around community engagement, listening to residents. And I think Angie's point about, what are schools for? And I think, we should be thinking of schools that they should be something bigger than just the classroom setting. Because they have these children for a huge amount of time, and there's much more that they can do in that local community to support, and empower local communities to do better things for their children, young people. So I think it's a discourse that we do need to have. And we've started it in Lambeth, particularly because we've got, as I said, particular high crime rates. And although that's abated with pandemic because people are locked in, we're anticipating that there's going to be an increase. And so we're wanting to be responsive with our community. And it's about empowering the community to be able to be responsive, to go into the school gates and talk to head teachers about and school staff about the things that affect their community that may then impact on their children when they're in school, and about having responsive services tailored to the neighbourhood. So not a blanket approach, more of a tailored approach to the needs of that community. I guess in terms of the high street, what we have done, I mean, obviously at the moment we're in the middle of the pandemic, and what Lambeth has done really well is just, you know, work with local communities and open up community halls. I've already mentioned schools, lots of different buildings just to support the vaccination and the lateral flow testing that we've done. So at the moment, that's what our buildings are being used for. And it has been very, very successful in the numbers of people who have been vaccinated, but also have been tested. I guess going forward and in the future, and as things hopefully become towards some kind of normal, although I think this probably is the normal for months and possibly years to come, is about the high street, because what we've seen is the high street in terms of numbers of shops have closed. So we need to think very differently about how we might use the high street so it can still become, it still is, you know, a hubbub of that community, and that there isn't those derelict buildings around. And I've just seen in the chat, people are saying, what about using it for learning, you know, for young people because of the issues around unemployment? So is there something that we can think about how we utilize those buildings to support our young and long-term unemployment through training and retraining individuals by utilizing those buildings?
Okay.
Pop-up businesses, you know, I think the other thing is about, you know, really sort of focus on entrepreneurial thinking, to think about how we can shift the business, the traditional, you know, the retail businesses, and thinking about other elements that we might be able to bring, like the digital world, you know, how we might capitalize on that, because that is you know, really been helpful in this current pandemic.
Okay, Melanie, that's fantastic. I'm just going to start polling our audience on some of this now, and we'll ask them about what they think about these new opportunities. But Roger, I know you wanted to pick up something. I'm going to come to you in just a second. But first, Peter, if we're repurposing buildings outside of schools to use for learning, what sort of buildings might they be, and what might they be used for?
Yeah, I'm a bit confounded on this question now, because it sounds as though we aren't short of school spaces.
Yeah.
But if we were, I mean, I had a previous life as a chartered building surveyor, so that's all about adapting buildings and the like. And basically, it goes back to a whole load of environmental issues, which is that there's a lot of embodied energy in an existing building, and you really, really ought to make the most of it rather than just knocking it down and building a new one. And so it makes perfect sense to try and reuse these buildings, but of course you need to do it in a fairly comprehensive way so that you get the better performance in all respects, and so that what you don't create is a shop that looks like a school or a school that looks like a shop. You actually want a building that does the job that it ought to do, and that's entirely possible. And it's entirely possible in quite a green way, really, and in a way which doesn't destroy and take apart the high street, and may in fact bring life into it. I was always interested that in Australia, we went to QUT, Queensland University of Technology, and they had a big debate there about what to do about a bridge over the river. And they were going to defend, they thought we're going to have an influx of people and it's going to be really dangerous. And then somebody made the opposite argument, which is that actually we have an influx of people and it'll be really safe because there's just loads of people about. And they went for the second argument, and they've got the safest campus you can imagine because people just walk through it, normal people. And it's not like a gated community or anything. So, I mean, the security thing is very important for children, but there are some really complex dimensions here in terms of urban design that also need to be taken into account.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I know that Angie's bursting to come onto this, but Roger, you wanted to talk to a previous point as well, didn't you?
Well, partly that, but I also want to raise another one. You know, so many people working from home, so many people staying at home, working locally. Does that create a local energy in the future that's going to remain post-pandemic? Because we're going to have flexibility to work from home remotely. Do we want to travel long distances to central retail, or are we going to support our local butcher and become more of a community-based society? I think there is evidence already that we've enjoyed that part of it, and when we can be released some levels of freedom, that we will probably be more locally based. And I wonder whether that's got any effect on the large school populations we sometimes see, centralisation of school services, but also all the other services. So, you know, we might get our major purchases on the Amazon account, but our local purchases on our high streets, it may have some positive impacts. And that was only an observation, really. And I just to sort of back up what Peter was saying, knocking down old buildings and being new ones is just the worst thing you can do for an embodied carbon footprint. And changing use is very straightforward, albeit quite an unpredictable cost base. So you need more flexible approach to how much, what's your benefits, and there's always some compromise with repurposing buildings for obvious reasons. You haven't got a blank sheet of paper. But I think from a what we should be doing as humans, that is exactly what we should be doing, is trying to generate new uses for our existing estates.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, Ange, thank you, Roger. Ange, now's your chance. We've got all the buildings in the high street at your disposal. Would you like any of them? And if so, what would you like them for?
Well, like Peter, I'm kind of shocked by what Merlin said. Well done, Lambeth, again. I'm used to going to the chief exec's office in a council and kind of roughly guessing where they think the demographic's going to go, with the additional comment always, but don't take our word for it because we've been wrong the last 5 times we've done this. It seems to me people need places to live. Not places to learn. So that would be my first point to make about our derelict high streets. But we do need more space in schools, and COVID has shown us that. And if we are going to go for a more blended approach of more independent learning, some digital learning, some face-to-face learning, which seems like a more grown-up model anyway, it's more of a university model, it would help students become more independent, then we do need more spaces. Schools do need more spaces, but Merlin's saying we've got them. So rather than worrying about whether we've got 30 in a room, if we're going to having a more university model of sometimes students are sitting on their own, sometimes they're in groups of 60, 90, 100, sometimes they're in 4, 5, 6s, then we need to repurpose the spaces we've got and use them. And Merlin has reassured us that we've got plenty of spaces. So
well, hang on.
They might be spread, but potentially we've got those spaces.
Yeah.
And in terms of repurposing, I think our schools need to look less like schools. And I'm sorry I've not brought any pictures, but we've spent 10 years making our schools look more domestic and less like institutions. Because if you go to some of the top independent schools in the country, that's what they look like. And it always strikes me that the maintained sector, if you go to the maintained sector, as most of us do, you get a much poorer environmental experience often. And so we've spent a long time making our schools not look like schools. So I think there's a lot of advantages in having old cinemas and old shops and so on. And they might not be absolutely perfect, but they can maybe make more creative spaces. And the last thing I wanted to say was we have a saying in the trust, which is a joke and it's shorthand. And the saying is it flame retardant? And that is our shorthand for how overwhelmed we are sometimes by the unreasonable and ridiculous requests and expectations that go way beyond what is rational safety. And we all want children to be safe. None of us come into education to not want children to be safe, and you can't learn if you're not safe, and we care about our children, we want them to be safe. But the world has gone mad in this respect, and I think what colleagues here have said is that our schools have become like fortresses. And the old 70s design of where you had passive supervision because members of your community were coming in to access the dentist or were coming in to access the library, not only have we lost all of that real understanding that the school belongs to the community, but we've lost all of that kind of natural engagement between the generations and all that passive supervision as well. So I think it'd be lovely to revisit all of that. I think we've lost a lot by putting up that secure perimeter that doesn't keep the nutter out anyway.
I think there's something really interesting happening here, isn't there? That schools have become increasingly a place for children to be. There's nowhere else for them to be. They've got home and they've got school. There's no youth clubs, or playgrounds are too dangerous and parents won't let them out cycling anymore and all of that stuff. So kids are in schools, and you're talking about wraparound services and kind of extending the use of that of schools for children. Now we've got the parents there too, because the parents are working from home. Parents are now next door to the school, so you've got the entire family within touching distance of that space, and we're starting to talk about maybe there are some spaces in between where you could have some people learning things and the parents buying things. This mixture of spaces. And someone was telling me earlier today about how every development is now becoming mixed use development, because there are no sort of single purposes anymore, and I think that plays into what Roger was saying earlier about flexible design as well. But I'm looking at the viewer questions, and I think we're answering most of these as they come in. But I think there's one area of education that we haven't addressed, which is around special education needs. And I wonder, Merlin, if there's anything that you'd like to add in terms of what we've been talking about in the sense of special education needs.
Absolutely. So as part of our strategy, because what we want is to achieve is that schools are inclusive. It's a inclusive space for all children to learn. We obviously recognise that some children have particular needs, and as a consequence, we've created special schools. But given what we found in terms of the spaces that we now have in our family of schools, we're now looking at send resource bases within those school settings, so that it's much more of an inclusive environment for, if I can call it, mainstream children, and also those children with special educational needs. And I think if you do any kind of consultation with youngsters with special needs, they will tell you they just want to be, they just want to go to a normal school, they'll say, and it's just about how we support them within those environments. So we've got a strategy. We're working with our head teachers to look at how we can utilize some of those spaces with wraparound support for those youngsters to be part of the mainstream community of schools.
And what about the reverse, that sort of situation that we were talking about earlier, where you've got school spaces and you've got school leavers? Are there ways that Lambeth are looking at keeping those kids in those schools, but to do other things, to start work, to launch their YouTube business? Well,
certainly something that we could explore. So for instance, we've got I chair a strategic program which is all around improving the educational outcomes and employment outcomes for our youngsters up until the age of 30. So around the table, we've got colleges and local universities. So that's something we hadn't actually thought about, but it's something that we certainly could explore around the table. Our colleges are really keen in terms of supporting those youngsters who are coming out, who are probably going to be disadvantaged because of the education gap with the pandemic. So it's certainly something I will bear in mind and have some conversations about. The other thing I just wanted to pick up, something that Ange says around the community and the bit about the community spirit. I think what the pandemic has shown, actually, that there is real community spirit. People have gone over and above to support their local communities during this period. And what I think we need to do is capitalize on that. Absolutely capitalize on that to support the local community. Thinking about, people have just set up pop-up shops to deliver food. Lots and lots of things have happened as a consequence of this. And I think the community has been agile and flexible to adjust and respond to some of the issues that's been in the community. So I think we're kind of, you know, certainly in our listening events, we're tapping on an open door.
Ange, is there anything that you'd like to add to what Merlin said, and also anything that you'd like to say in regards to keeping your kids for longer, and perhaps fostering them as entrepreneurs, as business people, as employees? Increasingly, we're all working remotely. Why can't we work from a classroom?
Yeah, I'm interested that entrepreneur has almost become a job in itself now, and I don't know when that happened. I must have got very old. The thing about the inclusion, it comes back to space again. I absolutely agree with Merlin that young people, they don't see themselves as special needs. They see themselves as young people. They want to be with their friends. Yeah. Most of what they learn from their friends while they're outside of the classroom. So if they're in a special unit somewhere, that makes that more difficult. And I think, again, space is so important here. If you look at why a lot of young people feel disengaged or struggle, it's not all to do with academic learning. It's to do with, it comes back to what the school feels like. Does it feel like somewhere where they belong and they are important? Or does it feel like an institution where they're expected to meet certain criteria in terms of exams, then they get churned out the end? And I think the way we use school spaces has a lot to contribute to that for young people. And I think Merlin's right. We need to be talking to young people more and more about what makes a more comfortable learning space for them. So I think that's a really important conversation to have around the whole SEND agenda. So one of the things that we've started to do with our schools, where we have bigger sites, and of course the pandemic has thrown up the issues of outside spaces for London schools, because we don't have any outside spaces in London schools. They're built on such tiny footprints, but we have a number of schools that are on big outside spaces, and we've started tentatively, but we've started offering apprenticeships and work-related learning schemes. So in 2 of our schools now, we have one in particular, the second's about to follow. We have young people who have a more unusual post-14 curriculum, where they're actually doing things on site. They're learning practical things on site, and we want to link that to apprenticeships. I think that's part of the whole reconsideration we're all doing of what it looks like post-14 because of what it looks like post-16. This drive to send every child to university doesn't help society, and it doesn't help young people, and it doesn't help us, because we need all kinds of young people to do all kinds of jobs, and having a degree doesn't help with at least half of those. So we're tending to do things with students we've got now, including looking at our post-16 courses, rather than bringing young people back after that. You know, they still tend to, once they leave, they go off somewhere else. There's no reason why we shouldn't explore that, but we're certainly doing different things at GCSE and post-16 level.
Great stuff, Ange. Thanks. Roger, I'm going to come to you in a second, and I'm going to ask you about apprenticeships, because I know that's a subject very close to your heart, and also about the WDC Building Lives initiative. But first, Peter, you wanted to just come in.
Just very quickly, it was in relation to the whole notion, 2 things. One is humans are social animals, of course. Yeah. And so I can't disagree with almost everything Ange says. And the whole notion of schools being a place where you feel you belong was a dimension on our study. It was individualization, the fact that you actually made your mark on the school and that you could feel you were there. And that articulates interestingly with universities, where we've lost that to a great extent because of central timetabling. People are like refugees wandering about big spaces. And so it's something we can regain. I think it's more like reception class, where you really feel as though you're there, you've got all sorts of options. And then as you get more able, you're more constrained. I've never understood that particular dimension. We're social animals, we are animals. That's the other thing, just to say, we are animals. We need fresh air, we need daylight, we need all those things. And we were looking at normal spaces in our study, and they were the things that were actually really holding back learning, because people just weren't in healthy environments in some cases. And so I'm just sticking up for things which sound rather utilitarian, because I think they're actually very important, but quite easily fixed very often.
Yeah, the building blocks of good solutions, aren't they? Roger, over to you.
Listen, thanks, Toby. I think one of the things I wanted to say was just about gearing your investments, whether they're repurposing or new builds, passive house or whatever. The most important thing is through the built environment, you get sort of 4 times gearing into your local community. So if you're spending 15 million on a school, you're actually getting a lot of money into the local community. And that's one of the things, certainly through frameworks, local employment is generated, but specifically to respond to your question about social value, which is a key part of the investment. One of the things we have a really good success rate on is building lives academies, where we're taking people straight off the unemployment register, really young people without hope, or certainly haven't had a chance. And I think one of the things we can do with when we're providing buildings is actually give people a stepping stone. And it's really about confidence. Once you see they've got value, once they see they've got value, got a CCS card, given some confidence away from the education phase into a life, they can really make a difference. And on each of our projects we change about 30 or 40 people through Building Lives Academy, which has really created some value for the communities we work in. And I just thought Toby invited me to mention it, so I thought I would add to that.
Well worth doing, Roger, and perhaps those academies can take place inside schools where classes.
Not only that, to take your point about local high streets, we usually take over a vacant high street space and actually put it in next to the building we're building, so people can drop in, use it for community space generally. It's been a really great community engaged project that actually has a really good feel factor as well, because it's not all just about the stats. It's real, and people feel things that are real.
It's real, and people feel things that are real. I can't think of a better way to finish. A better place to finish. It is. You have the last word, Roger. We've got to let our viewers. We've got to let our viewers get back to their working day. Perhaps they've got to take a daily exercise ration, or more likely join another Zoom call, or maybe they're going to find out that they know less than they thought about long division and the pharaohs of Egypt. Good luck to all you homeschoolers out there. But before you go, please join me in thanking our terrific panel for sparing their valuable time today to share their knowledge and their experience and their insight with us. It's been a real treat. Thank you very much indeed to you, Professor Peter Barrett of Salford University and Oxford University, and thank you, Merlin Joseph from Lambeth Council, and thank you, Ange Tyler of the Griffin Schools Trust, and thank you, Roger Forsdyke from Wilmot Dixon, both for your contribution to the conversation and for your kind sponsorship, which made this event possible. Thanks also to Inner Circle Consulting for their collaboration in bringing the session together. But most of all, viewers, as ever, thank you for again tuning in and gracing us with your attention and fueling the conversation with your questions. There are some left hanging, and if you join our LinkedIn Members Club, any responses from our panel that they send us by email to unanswered questions will be distributed and circulated through LinkedIn. Plus, you'll get an early heads up on the compelling themes and topics that we're going to be exploring next. The first of those is next Thursday at 11 a.m. when we're back with Davitt Jones-Bould to talk about the impact of financial pressures and changing PWLB regulations on councils, members and officers. Register for that and watch the video of this and all our other sessions at thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. Until next week, from our fabulous panel, from Wilmot Dixon and Inner Circle Consulting, from me and from everyone at 3 Fox, good afternoon.